Guten Erev Shabbos, my holy sisters and brothers. Great to be learning with you on a Friday afternoon as we're getting ready for Shabbat. It can't come soon enough. So exciting. We're opening tractate Bava Metzia, fascinating tractate. And it's actually chapter 2, as we'll talk about in a moment, as a traditional starting point for kids learning Talmud in a yeshiva. And there's reasons for that. And so some people, I think, are joining us perhaps for the first time in their Talmud journey. And so we extend you the warmest welcome. Welcome to AT Daily. Welcome to the AT community. Great to have you with us. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Friday, March 1st? Yehudit in South Carolina, Sharon in New Jersey, Bill in mid-Missouri, Shandor in the Bronx, Renee in Indiana, Guy in Ohio, Joe in the Inland Empire, Bella in Florida, Belle in Texas, Melissa in Great Neck, John in Scotland, Leona in Illinois, Stephen will need to watch the replay, Clarice saying Shabbat Shalom, Gail Manberg Featherston, hello, first time from California. Really great to have you with us. I hope you find the learning inspiring and uplifting. Lori checking in from Maine. Over there on the YouTube side, Marjorie in Georgia, Ella saying Shalom. It's great to have you all with us. Tractate Bava Metzia. So what is this? This is the 1,518th page of the 2,711 that constitutes the journey, the Daf Yomi journey through the Talmud Bavli, right? So this is the Babylonian Talmud, meaning it was the Jewish community in Babylonia, which had by then become part of the Persian Empire, that ended up completing the Talmud. There was a parallel project going on in Israel known as the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud. But this was during the brutal Roman occupation. And the Mishna was redacted around the year 200 of the Common Era. The Mishnah is the same in both places. And then the Gemara, right, that first layer of commentary on the Mishnah, which ended up being redacted about the year 500 of the Common Era. And by then, things were very, very difficult indeed in the Holy Land for the Jewish community. And that's why the Jerusalem Talmud was never completed. Okay, so... we're not going to do a whole introduction. If Talmud is new to you, highly recommend. There's all kinds of resources online, but this is a really good one to have. This is the introduction to the Talmud that is part of the Art Scroll Talmud Bavli. And even if you own the Koran, for example, we're doing the Koran mostly here in our class. I have the Schottenstein, the Art Scroll, Talmud Bavli inside the house. I keep the Koran here in the office. And I usually teach from the Koran because it's just slightly more universal and accessible. And also one thing I like about the Koran is that when we discuss matters of halacha, of Jewish law, very often in the Talmud, they debate back and forth. And then you're like, well, where did the law end up? And there's always a note about that in the Koran Talmud. But this introduction to sort of the Talmud generally, including many stories of the sages themselves, sort of biographical information about the sages, really good book. And I'm sure you can definitely get this at artscroll.com. And I think you can get it at Amazon also. But generally speaking, so everyone is familiar with the Bible, right? So the Bible is the Torah. The first 5 books are the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. Plus the prophets, right? The writings of the prophets, which follow the Torah, and then the writings, what's known as the writings, like Psalms and Proverbs, etc. All together, that makes Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. But that's the written Bible, right? And particularly the written Torah. And the written Torah was given at Mount Sinai simultaneously with the oral Torah. Now, only a few of the teachings that are at the core of the oral Torah were actually transmitted to Moses at Sinai. But why it's so important is because God was basically saying to Moses, here's the written Torah. This is the law. It is eternal. It will always be relevant. It will always apply. But you're going to have many new questions come up over time as, God could see into the future. He could see that humanity eventually would have, many centuries in the future, would have an industrial age, would have the age of science and technology, and all kinds of novel questions would come up over the history of the Jewish people that couldn't have been contemplated when the written Torah was given to, an agricultural society, shepherd type society. And when these questions would come up, there needed to be, a way to process them. And to make a long story short, there was an oral tradition that began God giving it to Moses, Moses to Joshua, Joshua to the elders to the prophets to the men of the great assembly, and eventually to the sages, right? And so the sages inherit this oral tradition. Some of it is laws, like I said, that were given to Moses at Sinai, but even more, it's a way of learning. It's a way of interpreting Torah, a way of understanding laws and answering questions that would come up over time. And the Talmud includes not only laws and discussions of law, but also folklore, stories, medicine, civil planning, urban planning. Bill made a good joke yesterday about Tractate Eruvin, and how only the Jewish people made urban planning spiritually uplifting. And really, there's no area of human life that the Talmud doesn't examine and ask, what is God's will for us in this? What is the proper way, the moral way, the ethical way, the righteous way, the way that God would have us do it? What is the way to have a friendship? What is the way to build a house? What is the way to design a plumbing system? What is the way to regulate marital relations between a husband and wife? What is the way to transport your goods to market? What is the honest and righteous way to do business when certain kinds of disagreements come up? Like just every aspect of human life. Okay, that's enough introduction for today. Let's get into Tractate Bava Metzia. So Tractate Bava Metzia is the middle gate. Bava Kama was the opening gate. Metzia is the middle gate. And Bava Basra will be the end gate of what used to be one massive tractate called Nezikin, damages. And basically the set of 3 tractates, and they're all large tractates, multi-volume tractates, here in the middle of the Talmud, basically have to do with business, right? And marketplace and transactions. The way that people actually run their lives. You go to the market and you buy, chicken for dinner, and you buy clothes for your kids, and you buy a piece of land to build a house on it, and you buy a donkey or a car in modern times to transport you and your goods. And we're constantly engaging in transactions with our neighbors, with strangers, with our families, with friends. And there's definitely a righteous and Torah-ordained way to handle those affairs. Now, here in Bava Metzia, we're going to open by talking about 2 people that have found an object, and both claim that they found it first and that they have the right to keep it. Generally, we know that there's a Torah law that says if you find something that belongs to your fellow, you have an obligation to make best efforts to return it. In fact, you even have to guard it in case your friend is away. Not just your friend, your neighbor, or the stranger who lives across town that you don't like, right? But it's his object. Let's say you find his goat and he's away for 6 months, so you're gonna have to bring it onto your property, feed that nasty goat, take care of that nasty goat, and when that guy you don't like finally comes back from his trip abroad, you can give the goat back to him, and you can charge him for what it took for you to feed and take care of his goats, some kind of a fair price. But you do have an obligation to return what you found to your fellow. That's a written law in the Torah. But sometimes it's impossible to determine who the owner of a found object is. It's a kind of situation. I mean, somebody drops, a $20 bill on the street in Manhattan. Okay, there's no way you're going to find out, who is the person that dropped that $20 bill, and whoever dropped it has certainly despaired of ever getting it back. So they're finders keepers, right? The one who finds it is permitted to keep it. But what if two people grab it at the same time? Then what are we going to do? And we're going to be talking about that today. Okay, so just a short introduction from Rav Steinsaltz. So when we talk about the Koren Talmud, that was an elucidation created by Rabbi Steinsaltz. And he says, by way of introduction, Bava Metzia deals with issues relating to business, specifically those that the Torah mentions explicitly. And the topics discussed in this tractate include the laws of lost and found items, the loading and unloading of animals, verbal mistreatment, exploitation, charging interest, feeding workers, depositing and borrowing items without withholding wages, and the prohibition against damaging collateral. Bava Metzia expresses one of the unique aspects of Torah law, namely that it does not distinguish between civil law and ritual law. Jewish civil law is based not on a social contract, but on requirements defined by Torah law and rabbinic law. Accordingly, interpersonal relationships and civil laws are viewed as part of the relationship between the Jewish people and God. And although there are certain distinctions made by the Torah between civil and ritual law, in general, they are interwoven in the Torah text, as can be seen, for example, in Exodus chapters 21 and 23, Leviticus chapter 19, and Deuteronomy chapters 21 through 25. The introduction is longer, but I just wanted to highlight that little part of it. And now we open chapter 1. We're on page 2 of Tractate Bava Metzia. All Talmudic tractates begin on page 2. That's how they do it. And then just a very short introduction. This is unusual. We don't usually have this before the first Mishna here in chapter 1. The early commentaries ask why this chapter, which discusses the details of the laws of found items, precedes the second chapter, which discusses the fundamental laws of found items, right? You would think that you would start by saying, okay, if you find something, in these situations, you have an obligation to return it. In these situations, you have an obligation to keep it. As so often happens in the Talmud, instead of starting with the basic law and then looking into the cases and variations on that, the sages jump into a case that they find interesting, and they just assume that you know about the sources of the law and the basic laws of found objects. And often in other tractates, it's not until we're into the middle or later parts of a tractate that we get back to the fundamental laws. Here, at least, we'll get back to it at chapter 2. And chapter 2 is, in fact, where children who learn Talmud, in a yeshiva, that's where they start. But we will, of course, start on page 1. Now, Tosafos explained that as Tractate Bava Metzia follows Tractate Bava Kama that we just completed, the laws of found items are elucidated in this chapter as a continuation of the topics that were discussed in the last chapter of Bava Kama when we were talking about the division of items between litigants by means of an oath. Right? When people are trying to extract damages from someone or extract property from someone, they say, you stole this from me, or I deposited that with you, and there's no witnesses to testify to that. So in certain cases where we have competing claims, the court will say to one or both of the litigants, swear an oath that you own what you claim you own, or that you gave what you claim you gave. And because in that ancient society where this was the norm, people were, if you had to commit a crime, right? Obviously you want to live a righteous life. But if they had to commit a crime, they would rather steal than swear a false oath, right? So in other words, they might have stolen something, but they're not going to now stand up in court, before the community, before the sages, and before God, and swear a false oath, right? So it actually was something that would motivate people to tell the truth, even if they had stooped so low as to steal. Now, at the end of Bava Kama, we made very clear, how careful, how punctilious a person must be to make sure that they never steal, even by accident. So here, as we continue, as we now leave Bava Kama and enter Bava Metzia, they're starting with an issue that sort of does feel like a little bit of a continuation of one of those litigations or conflicts that we saw in Bava Kama that would lead to someone having to swear an oath because there are no witnesses to testify what the outcome should be or what the facts were, so that the judges can say what the outcome should be. Now, the Rosh explains that because there is a suspicion of theft in this case that we're about to discuss, these matters are juxtaposed with the laws of theft, which are described at length in Bava Kama. All right, so let's get into it. Mishnah number 1 here at the beginning of a tractate Bava Metzia, chapter 1, Mishnah number 1. If two people came to court, right, to the Beis Din, to the rabbinic court, holding a garment, right? And now it says a talis, which is the word that we use to describe a prayer shawl, right? That we wear usually in synagogue, but really in the mornings when, men pray, at least Orthodox men when they pray, and put on tefillin and, a talis, the prayer shawl, we refer to that as a talis or a talit. But the word doesn't necessarily mean a prayer shawl. It can refer to a cloak, to any garment. But what's important is that it does have tzitzis on it. It has ritual fringes. So the law is any garment that you wear that has 4 corners, sort of like a poncho that's a 4-corner blanket, really, with a hole in the middle for your head. At those 4 corners is where we put the tzitzis, the ritual fringes. So it's that kind of a garment. And 2 people come to the court holding it, right? So you see the tug of war. They're both holding the garment. And this one, the first litigant says, I found it. And that one, the second litigant says, I found it. And this one says, all of it is mine. And that one says, all of it is mine. How does the court adjudicate this case? So this one takes an oath that he does not own any less than half of the garment. And that one takes an oath that he does not own any less than half of the garment, right? They both claim they own all of it. So certainly they're going to be comfortable claiming that they own at least half of it, right? No less than half of it. And in the absence of any other evidence other than their claims that each one of they found something that the original owner would have despaired of losing, that there's no way they were going to get it back. It's a situation where you can have finders keepers. So what are they going to do? They're going to divide it. And when we say that they divide it, if it's the kind of garment that you could literally cut it in half, and the 2 halves would basically have the value of half of the original, then we would actually divide it. A little bit like, what we wouldn't do with Solomon's baby. But if in fact this cloak is only worth something, if you don't cut it in half, and then by cutting it in half you'd ruin it, it'd be worthless, then we would sell it, and then the proceeds would be split between the 2 people that found it. In order to get to that, because they both claim that they own all of it and that they were the finder, and there's no other evidence than their competing claims, we're going to make them swear that oath that they are telling the truth, and then they're going to divide it. Now, the Mishnah continues. If this one says, all of it is mine, and that one says, half of it is mine, right? This one says, I found it, it's all mine. That one says, we found it at the same time, so we should split it, right? So he's admitting that this one owns at least half of it. This one admits nothing. He thinks he owns all of it. Interesting, in that situation, since they both agree that half of the cloak belongs to one of them, they agree on that, so the conflict between them is only about the other half. Therefore, the one who says all of it is mine takes an oath that he does not have ownership of less than 3/4, right? 3/4 of it. And the one who says that half of it is mine takes an oath that he does not have ownership of less than 1/4 of it, right? Half of the half. And then this one takes 3/4 and that one takes 1/4. If two people were sitting in a riding position on the back of an animal like a donkey or a camel, or one was sitting in a riding position on the animal and the other one was leading it by its halter, and this one says, all of it is mine, and that one says, all of it is mine, and this one takes a note that he does not have ownership of less than half, and that one takes a note that he does not have ownership of less than half, then they divide it. Obviously, they don't cut the animal in half. They sell it and divide the proceeds. And when they admit to the validity of each other's claims, or when they each have witnesses attesting to their claims, then they divide the disputed item without taking an oath, as an oath is administered only in a case where the parties have no other way to prove their claims. And that concludes our first Mishnah here in chapter 1. Now the Gemara, the discussion on this Mishnah. The Gemara asks, why do I need the Tana, right? So the sages of the Mishnah in the Mishnaic period are known as Tanaim, plural, or Tana, singular. And the sages of the Gemara, or what's known as the Talmud, is the Gemara and the Mishnah. So the sages of the Gemara period, who are the next several generations commenting on the Mishnah, they are known plural as Amoraim, and singular and Amora. Right? So now they're talking about the Tana, meaning who was the sage that formulated this Mishnah. He's not named in the Mishnah. That means it's an unattributed Mishnah, and that means that pretty much everyone agrees that this is the law here. So the Gemara asks, why do I need the Tana to teach two separate claims made by each party? Why does the Talmud say both this one says I found it and that one says I found it? And in addition, it also talks about that each one claims all of it is mine and that one says all of it is mine. Let the Tana who's formulating this Mishnah teach just one case. And the Gemara answers, the correct understanding of the Mishnah is that it teaches one claim of each party, as their claims were made like this. This one says, I found it, and all of it is mine. And that one says, I found it, and all of it is mine. We split the claims for the sake of the discussion in the Mishnah when we're explaining it, and there's a reason why we do that. But it's not like there was two different litigations or two different stages in the litigation. Each one says, I found it, and it's mine. So the Gemara asks, but then let the Tana teach a case where each one merely claims, I found it. And I would know that the intention of each litigant is to claim all of it is mine. Once he says, I found it, what follows obviously is, and therefore it's mine, right? Since this is, again, this is a case where we can't give it back to the original owner who lost it. For whatever reason, that's impossible. He can't be found. That's not on the table. And that's why it's finders keepers. But each one is claiming that he's the one that found it and therefore it belongs to him. So why do we need to say that they're arguing about I found it versus I found it, and that they're arguing about all of it is mine and all of it is mine? The two things follow. Why do you need to say this? And the Gemara answers, if the Tana would teach only that each one claimed I found it, I would say that what is the meaning of the claim I found it? It means I saw it. In other words, this guy might be claiming that he saw the item first, and he believes, erroneously, that even though it never reached his possession, he acquired it through mere sight, right? Now you can hear little kids arguing, I saw it first. No, I saw it first. It's mine because I saw it first. Well, seeing it first doesn't get you anything at all. You have to go there and acquire it. Now, how do you acquire it? Obviously, if it's something you can pick up, okay, so you picked it up first, like this garment. But that's not the only way that you can take possession of something, as we will discuss at greater length. But at any rate, these claims are to the exclusion of someone who thinks he acquired it just by seeing it first, because no, it didn't enter his possession. And that's why when he says, I found it, what he says, it doesn't mean anything. Now, the Gemara challenges this explanation. But how can you say that what the term I found it means is actually I saw it. I mean, you could say it might include litigants who say that, but it's not going to be that way in every case, right? There's certainly people who actually found it, and that's what they're arguing about. But how can you say that the term I found it actually means I saw it? But didn't Rabboni say, in interpreting the verse, and so shall you do with every lost item of your brother's, which he has lost, and you have found it, Deuteronomy 22, verse 3, that the phrase, and you have found it, means, this indicates that it came into his possession. The term in the Torah refers exclusively to a situation where the item is in the possession of the finder. Now, you're not supposed to turn your back on the lost property of your fellow, but your obligation to care for the animal until you can return it, etc., it doesn't actually kick in until you take possession of that found animal or that found object, right? Just seeing it doesn't create all the obligations that go with once it's come into your possession. And now the Gemara answers, indeed, the phrase, and you have found it, in that verse, certainly indicates that the item has come into his possession. But one might say that the Tana of our Mishnah employed colloquial language in our Mishnah. And in colloquial language, once a person sees an item, he says, I found it, even if it did not yet come into his possession, because he believes that he acquired it through mere sight, since it would have been possible to understand the claim of, I found it, in this manner. The Tana teaches that the litigant states definitively, all of it is mine, to teach that one does not acquire a lost item through sight alone. Now, here we're seeing something that's quite interesting. Let's stop and point it out for a second. That when we're learning Talmud, when we're learning Gemara, when we're learning Mishnah, we're engaging in this discussion that has gone for thousands of years, sort of in the community of the educated, shall we say, right? So it doesn't mean that everyone who's learning Talmud is a rabbi. I'm not a rabbi. Most of the people in our class are not rabbis. So it doesn't mean that you must have the full training and tools and experience that you could be a judge, you could serve in a rabbinic court to engage with the tradition. But a lot of what we hear the sages talking about is sages talking to other sages, and sages assuming that the people that they're talking with have a certain amount of knowledge. For the sages, they had the whole Hebrew Bible memorized. They had the whole Mishnah memorized. And there's not so few of them over time that even had the entire Talmud memorized. I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. I don't know if we have brains like that anymore. I suppose we do, but we just, rely, from computers to even notebooks, pens, and papers. Like, we just don't try to get so much information in our heads, but they did, And so when you think about that, the fastest computer in the world is not as fast as the human brain. If you have, all of Scripture in your head, I mean, the connections that you could make between verses here and there in different books of the Bible, it's amazing, right? And so they could speak to each other in a kind of shorthand way that's difficult for us, and that's why we need the notes and the commentaries, etc., to help us understand. But even in their time, right, they're talking to each other as, well, how do you judge a case? How do you give a ruling of law when people come before you? And then, and clearly not everyone in their world was this learned. Not at all, right? So they're very cognizant of, we as sages, we as the educated people who are discussing these laws and issues, will have a way of speaking with each other that is not the way that regular people speak with each other. And we have to understand that when they're arguing and they use terms that sound like our legal terms, it's not necessarily that they have the same intent that we would have. We meaning the sages of the Mishna, the sages of the Gemara. And so they're very mindful of, this is how I use language, this is how you use language, this is how a sage in Bava speaks, and how he defines certain terms, and this is how a sage in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel, speaks even back then. And then the people, just the regular inhabitants of the various cities that come up in Jerusalem, in Caesarea, and Tiberia, in Sfas, in Hebron, or in Bava, in Mechozai, in Nehardea, in Pumbedisa. And everyone has slightly different definitions of terms. There's no internet where people can look stuff up. And they're very mindful of the subtle nuances of language and how that could lead to different understandings and different conflicts. Okay, let's keep going. So the Gemara asks, but if that was the objective of the Tana, right, to acknowledge the fact that people might come into a court and say, I found it, when in fact all they meant was, I saw it first. And that's why the Tana articulated it this way in our Mishnah. So the Gemara asks, but if that was the objective of the Tana, let him teach that each party need only state, all of it is mine. And the litigant would not need to say, I found it. And the Gemara answers, if the Tana had taught that it is sufficient for each party to claim only, all of it is mine, I would say that in general, when the Tana teaches that one claims, I found it, he means that the finder acquires the item through mere sight. Therefore, he taught that the litigants claimed, I found it, and he taught that the litigants claimed, all of it is mine. And what's he teaching? He's teaching us that only when the litigants each make both of these claims, I found it, and I am entitled to all of it because I found it alone, I myself alone, then that's the situation we're talking about, right? And the Tana verbalized it this way, or wrote it this way, articulated it this way, so that we would understand without ambiguity that this is a situation where both people are claiming, I found it, I alone found it, and that's why I'm entitled to all of it. That's the claim. Now, Rav Papa said, and some say it was said by Rav Shimi Bar Ashi, and some say it was an unattributed statement, that the first clause of our Mishnah, where each party says, I found it, is actually referring to a case of a found item, where two people found one item, like it sounds, and the latter clause, where each party says, all of it is mine, that's actually referring to a case of buying and selling, where each party claims that he is the one who bought an item from the seller. Well, we both, I don't know about him, but I went to that store. There was a unique object in the store. I gave the owner of the store $100 so that object would be mine. He said, great, I just want to polish it for you. Come and pick it up this afternoon. And then this one says, that's what happened to me. I went in that store. There was a unique item. I gave him $100. He said, come back later and it'll be yours. And so that what they're saying is that this store owner, either because he made a mistake or because he was duplicitous, sold it to two different people, right? And now they're both saying, I'm the legitimate buyer and I want it, right? Now that's a situation where they didn't find it, but rather where they both claim that they paid for it, and there's only one of them. So it's a little bit different than the law of a found item. And it is necessary for the Mishnah to teach its ruling, both with regard to found items and with regard to items where the dispute is over that two people both claim they purchased it. Now we're on page 2b. Why do we need a ruling in both cases and we can't learn out one case from the other? Because had the Tana taught the case of a found item only, I would say that it is only in the case of a found item that the sages imposed an oath on each of the ones who claim they found it. As in that case, one can rationalize his actions, right? A person might be thinking, rationalizing to himself, and say, well, this other party who in fact found it, right? In other words, one of them actually found it and the other one's a liar, right? So what they're saying is they're trying to get into the psychology of the liar. Why does he think he can get away with this? Well, one reason might be, or one reason why he's morally justifying it to himself is because he says to himself, that other one who in fact found the item, he's not losing anything by having to split it with me. as he had nothing to begin with before he found it. It's not like, he worked hard for a year and saved up money and then went and bought this thing. I mean, he was lucky that he found it. He happened to find it 30 seconds before I found it. And if we had found it at exactly the same moment, then he would have had to split it with me. So, me coming in and saying, no, we found it at the same time, what does he lose, right? That's what a person might be saying to himself. It's not right. It's not the right thing to do, but that's how he might be thinking. But in the case of buying and selling, right, where you can't rationalize it to yourself that way, if you know that the other one is the actual purchaser and you're a liar, you can't tell yourself that what does he think? He gets the right to buy that. He bought it. He saved up his money and bought it. So this rationalization wouldn't work. Again, the rationalization is not morally correct. It's just how people think. But they wouldn't think that about a purchaser. And conversely, had the Tana of our Mishnah taught the case of buying and selling alone, one might say that it is specifically in this case that the sages imposed an oath upon him because he could rationalize his actions, saying to himself, well, the other party gave money to the seller and I gave money to the seller, and now that I need it for myself, I will take it and let the other one go to the trouble to buy another item like the first item. But in the case of a found item where that cannot be said because there's only one unique item that was lost and now found, say that the sages did not suspect that he seized an item that did not belong to him, and therefore there is no need to impose an oath upon him. Right? You might have thought that. Therefore, both cases needed to be stated, that whether the dispute is over a found item or where two people claim that they each bought it, and there's no way to prove which one is the actual purchaser, that we would use an oath and each one swears that he believes his claim to be true, and then we're going to divide it between them. Now the Gemara asks, how can the Mishnah be referring to a case of buying and selling? It says, I found it, right? The Mishnah was literally worded. Two people come to the court holding a garment, and this one says, I found it, and that one says, I found it. So are you saying, I found it at, Target? I found it at Walmart? Is that what they're saying? I mean, it sounds more like a lost object that was found. So the Gemara asks, how can the Mishnah be referring to a case of buying and selling? But let us see, from whom did the seller take the money? This seems to be like objectively ascertainable. Who is the actual purchaser? Let's ask the seller. Who did you receive the money from? Obviously, the one who gave him the money is the one who bought it, right? Well, the Gemara answers, no. It is necessary in a case where the seller took money from both of them. He accepted the money willingly from one to whom he wanted to sell the item, and he received the money against his will from the one to whom he did not want to sell the item. So this would be a case where, one is a guy he does business with and he was happy to sell it to him. And another is some kind of coercive bully who says, I want that. Now, he's not as big a thug as to just saying, I'm going to take it. But he's a big enough thug that he says, no, you're going to sell it to me. Here's the $100. It's mine. Okay, so, now that's a very different set of circumstances. But both of the buyers will say, I bought it, I paid for it. So what about that? So consequently, the matter would be clarified by means of an oath, right? If maybe the seller isn't even around to say, well, yeah, I took the money from both of them, but that one's a thug and that one's my actual customer. But maybe he's not available to even give that information. So what do we have before us? Two people who both swore, I paid $100. It's my object. There's only one object. So we're going to end up making both of them swear that what they're saying is true, and then they're going to divide. Now, the Gemara suggests, let us say that our Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Ben Nanas. And this is a familiar way of speaking. In the Talmud, now we're going to introduce a law or a Mishna or a Baraisa, which is contemporaneous with the Mishna, which somehow contradicts what we've just learned in our Mishnah. Right? So let us say that our Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Ben Nanas. As if it were in accordance with the opinion of Ben Nanas, doesn't he say that an oath is not administered to two parties in court when one of them is certainly lying? And we learn this Mishnah in Tractate Shavuos, oaths, on page 45a. Not weeks, not Shavuos, but Shevuos, right? Oaths. So with regard to a case where a man said to his laborer, go to the storekeeper and he will give you food in lieu of your salary. And sometime later, the laborer claimed that the storekeeper did not give him anything, while the storekeeper claimed that he did. So the rabbis say the storekeeper and the laborer must each take an oath to support their claims, and the employer must pay them both. We don't know who's lying, right? The employer at some other time gave money to the storekeeper, and that's why the storekeeper is supposed to give food to the workers of the employer, right? So now the laborer says, well, I went to the storekeeper and he didn't feed me. The storekeeper says, the laborer came to me and I did feed him. One of them is lying. And now when they both swear an oath, there's no way to untangle it. So the employer, because, he created the situation, I guess he should have, worked with a more guaranteed system that wouldn't create the conflict. He's going to have to pay the storekeeper who claims that he did feed the laborer, and he's going to have to pay the laborer who claims that he was never fed. And this is going to be based on the fact that they have contradictory claims, and each of them swears an oath to that effect. That's what the rabbis ruled. And they were the majority when that question came up, and Ben Nanas was the minority, the minority opinion, right, who opposed them, and he said something different. The rabbis say the storekeeper and the laborer must each take an oath to support their claims, and then the employer must pay both of them. Ben Nanas says in response, how can you allow these people, i.e. the laborer, and those people, meaning the storekeeper, to come to take an oath in vain? Since one of them is definitely lying, the sages would not impose the taking of an oath that by definition must be false, right? Where clearly he says, I didn't get any money from him, and the other one says, I gave him money. So one of them is lying. If they both swear an oath that they're telling the truth, then one of them swore a false oath. Now, it can be that two people both believe they're telling the truth. That's okay. But if we know for a fact that one of them is lying, the whole situation is a problem because the sages are imposing a situation where for sure one of them will swear a false oath. And we don't want to create that situation. And that's why Ben Nanas says we don't allow them to swear oaths. We don't have them swear oaths in a situation where one of them will definitely be swearing a false oath. Now, the Gemara rejects this suggestion. It is even possible for you to say that our Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Ben Nanas. Right? He says we don't have them swear where one of them for sure is lying. Now, where the two people are holding the talus, each saying, I found it and it is mine, isn't it so that one of them is telling the truth and one of them is lying? Not necessarily. They might both believe with all their heart that they're telling the truth, right? There, in the case of the laborer and the storekeeper, an oath is certainly being taken in vain, as it's clear that one of them is lying. But here, there is room to say that there is no oath taken in vain. Say that both of them are taking an oath truthfully, as they lifted the item together, and therefore each of them owns half of it. So in this case, Ben Nanas would agree that they can both take an oath. Now the Gemara suggests further, so then let us say that our Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Sumachos. As if it were in accordance with the opinion of Sumachos, didn't he say the following principle? In a case of property of uncertain ownership, the parties divide it without taking an oath. So the Gemara rejects this suggestion. Rather, what opinion does the Mishnah follow? Does the Mishnah follow the opinion of the rabbis who disagree with Sumachos? Don't they say that in a case of property of uncertain ownership, the burden of proof rests upon the claimant? So in the case of the Mishnah, neither side offers proof. A general principle is that if a plaintiff comes to the court and he says that, Joe Schmo over here, he owes me $100. Maybe because he stole it from me. Maybe because I deposited $100 with him and he hasn't given it back to me. He was supposed to guard it from me like a banker and he hasn't given it back to me. Maybe it's because I lent him $100 and he hasn't returned the loan. Maybe it's because, he rented a tool from me and he damaged it and it's $100 worth of damage. Whatever the reason, I'm trying to get $100 from Joe Schmo. Before the court will step in and take $100 from Joe and give it to me, I'm going to have to prove my case. I'm going to have to bring the evidence. I'm going to have to bring the witnesses. And in the absence of the clear and convincing truth, they're not going to take money from Joe and give it to me. Here, where we don't have witnesses, how is it that the court is going to step in and divide property and make people, swear oaths and everything that they're going to do? The reason must be because we're uncertain of how to proceed, and it's not a matter of taking from one and giving to the other, right? That's why the case begins with they're both holding the garment, right? And both of them are sure that it belongs to them. And then as we've seen, there's other kinds of cases where one says, I'm sure it's mine. And the other one says, I'm not sure if it's mine or his. Right? That's a certain claim, a claim stated with certainty, versus an uncertain claim. A claim that he says, if they're both speaking honestly, this one really believes it's all his. This one says, I don't know. It might be yours, it might be mine. I'm not sure. Now, that might be a situation where the certain claim is going to trump the uncertain claim. But it's not as simple as that either. So let's keep going. Right. So let's just read that again. So what is the comparison? Granted, if you say that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, there is room to distinguish the two cases. There, in the case of property of uncertain ownership, where both parties are not grasping the property, then the rabbis say that the burden of proof rests upon the claimant, since the one with possession of the property ostensibly has the right to that property. Possession is 9/10 of the law. You want to remove it from his possession? You're going to have to prove that however he came into possession of it was faulty, was illegal, was wrong. And so you got to prove that because he now has it. And that's a much higher burden of proof than if it's sitting there between them, not in the possession of either one. And the Gemara continues to state it's proof that the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Sumachos. But if you say that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Sumachos, how do you resolve the following contradiction? Now, if there, in a case where they are not both grasping the property, they nevertheless divide it without taking an oath, here, where they are both grasping the property, is it not all the more so that they should divide it without taking an oath? Why are they taking an oath? And the Gemara rejects this suggestion. You may even say that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Sumachos, and when Sumachos states that in a case of property of uncertain ownership, the parties divide it without taking an oath, that is in the case of an uncertain claim versus an uncertain claim. This one says, it might belong to you, it might belong to me. That one says, it might belong to you, it might belong to me. Okay. Let's divide it, right? But in a case of a certain claim and a certain claim, that's our Mishnah. Both are certain that it belongs to them. Where each party states definitively that he is entitled to the property, there Sumachos does not say that they divide the property without taking an oath. And perhaps even Sumachos would agree that that is a situation where they have to take oaths in order to get half the property. Now the Gemara asks, and according to the opinion of Rabba bar Rav Huna, who said that Sumachos says that even in a case of certain claim versus certain claim, that the parties will divide the property without taking an oath, because oaths are serious business and we're not going to impose them unless we have to, then what is there to say to establish the Mishnah in accordance with the opinion of Sumakos? And the Gemara answers, you may even say that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Sumakos. When Sumakos says that the property of uncertain ownership is divided, he is referring to a case where the litigants have a financial association with the item, independent of their claims to it. But where the litigants do not have a financial association with the item beyond their claims, they do not divide it without taking an oath. Now, what is this financial association? Many explanations have been suggested to explain this term, derara de mamona, financial association. Rashi's opinion is that it means loss of money, i.e., a case where one or both of the parties involved will incur a loss if his claim does not stand. Tosafos explained that the circumstances themselves gives rise to an uncertainty, even without the litigants stating their claims. Ramban maintains that it is referring to circumstance where the two litigants do not contradict each other with regard to the primary facts upon which their respective claims are based. Ramban shows that Rabbeinu Hananel and Rambam also interpret the phrase in that manner. Okay, so based on this idea that it's not just I found it, but maybe it's something like, well, I found it and I was counting on using it, at the big auction that I'm having tomorrow. I'm financially invested in this. And the other one maybe is not financially invested in it. Is that going to sway us toward this guy or not? Now the Gemara asks, but is it not a kal v'chomer inference? Right? Kal v'chomer is a way of interpreting law where we say, if in this difficult case we understand what the law is, then with the same facts in an easy case, all the more so is the law going to be like this. So that's kind of the rhythm of it. The Gemara asks, but is this not a kal v'chomer inference? If they're in a case where this master has a financial association with the item, and that master has a financial association with the item, and there is room to say that it belongs entirely to one of them, and there is also room to say that it belongs entirely to the other one, and nevertheless, Sumachos says that since it is property of uncertain ownership, they divide it without taking an oath, then here, where the litigants have no financial association with the item, as there is room to say that it belongs to both of them, all the more so is it not clear that they should divide it without taking an oath. And the Gemara answers, and I'm almost done for today. We're actually on 3, I'm very close to done. We're already on 3a. So let me just refresh the questions document. And the Gemara answers, you may even say that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Sumachos, and this oath is instituted by rabbinic law in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. As Rabbi Yochanan says, this oath, administered in the case of two people holding a garment, is an ordinance instituted by the sages. Why? So that everyone will not go and seize the garment of another and say it is mine. If it's enough to say it's mine, no, it's mine, and then we make them divide it, well, then people are just going to, willy-nilly start grabbing other people's stuff and say it's mine. Well, let's go to court and argue it out. And since we're both claiming it's ours, then we're going to end up splitting it, right? This would be a terrible type of precedent to establish. So says Rabbi Yochanan, the reason that they swear an oath in the court, this is not the type of situation that the Torah stipulates in written law about oath-taking, right? Usually an oath-taking is where you say, for example, I deposited $1,000 with you and now I'd like it back. And the defendant says, well, you deposited $500 with me, and here it is, but you did not deposit $1,000 with me. So there's a partial admission of the evidence. There, I think the Torah says explicitly, and he'll swear an oath that, that's all that he is supposed to return, and we will believe him. And that's a case of an oath. And there's also the oath of a robber who stole something and then swore he didn't take it, and then he confesses that he did. and the penalties that accrue to that. But this situation of two people saying it's mine, the sages, the rabbis stepped in and said, we're going to make them take oaths as a policy matter because this is going to discourage people from running around and making spurious claims. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let's pick it. Let's get some questions here. There's just one from Bill. But wait, we're not administering the oath to two people when one is lying, because surely in order to be lying, you must believe you're not telling the truth. That is, if you really do think that what you're saying is true, you might be wrong, but you're not lying. Exactly. That's the case where these two people, that's possible where these two people are holding the garment, that each believes it. But in the case where one says, I gave him the money, and the other one says, I did not receive money, it's possible they're making a mistake, but I think they were giving circumstances there between the employee, the shopkeeper, and the laborer, where they meant to create facts where it's not that one of them is making a mistake and the other one's telling the truth, but rather one is telling the truth and one is lying. And we don't make that assumption here, right? In this case, it is very much possible that both believe their claim, both believe they're telling the truth. And as you say, that's why we can make them swear an oath, because we're not creating a situation where one of them is swearing a false oath. For sure, it might be true, but it's not for sure true that one will be swearing a false oath. And so we can impose the oaths on both of them. So Joseph says, is there ever a time when one is compelled to just give the item for the sake of peace or a gesture of such? I mean, it's interesting. I'm not sure what the answer to your question is, Joseph, but it sounds like that's what Sumakos was saying. Okay, we have competing claims. The claims are strong enough that they don't feel like one is spurious, right? We have reason to believe them, and these people don't have any kind of history of being liars or being engaging in litigation all the time. We don't have any reason to believe, a priori reason to believe that they're speaking falsely. So we'll divide it without imposing an oath. And that sounds like what you're saying, just for the sake of peace. All right, fine. Let's just divide it and go home. But the sages aren't going to do that because there is some kind of objective underlying truth of who it belongs to and who it doesn't. And we're not just as a matter of convenience and so we can go home early. All right, let's divide it. So if there's a way to reach that higher truth, and we can use oaths to get us there, the sages are willing to do it. But because oaths are a very serious matter, they're not going to impose it willy-nilly, right? So that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow night at the usual Saturday night time, which is to say when Shabbos ends here in LA. I think candle lighting today is like 5:40 maybe. Ish. So Shabbat's going to end for us about 6:50. I think last week I got on the air by like 7:40. So, tomorrow night, LA time, about 7:40, 7:50, I should be on the air. And then all the other times, all the other 6 days, it's very regular. Sunday to Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific, Friday at noon. And Saturday, as the days get longer into summer, it'll be later and later. And then once we're back in the fall, it'll get earlier and earlier. That's how it works. Have a great night. Have a great Shabbos. All the best.